Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a full scene card to share with you using Happy Pumpkin Season. So let's get started. This is the Happy Pumpkin Season from Stacey Yakula. Really cute set. I stamped out the bunny in the wagon with the pumpkins, and then also two separate pumpkins. I stamped one of those twice onto some smooth white cardstock using extreme black ink. I'm then colouring them with Copic markers. So I'm starting off by colouring in the pumpkins, and I'm using E19 as my darkest shade to add that basically around the edges, so anywhere that I think would kind of be indented. Pumpkins are a weird shape, so I wanted it to look like the bit at the front was sort of further out. And the way that I find to do that is to add the darker colours around the outside and then the lighter colour on the inside. So I blended that out with YR18, then YR16, YR15, and then finished off with YR12. And then I used the G82 for the stem of the pumpkin. And I coloured all of the rest of the pumpkins in the same way. Then for the bunny, I'm using some warm grey colours. I'm starting off with W5, just adding that around the outside of the bunny's face. The great thing with these images is that they're drawn so that they do have some texture to them, so you don't have to be necessarily really precise and really careful with your colouring on these images, which I always find really helpful. So I'm blending that out with the W3. And then I go in with W1, and then for my lightest shade I'm using W0, and then I do go back in with the W3 and the W1 just to make sure that I've got enough contrast between the different shades. I wanted the outside edge just to be a little bit darker. And then for the ears, I'm starting off with R01, blending that out with R00, and then I thought it wasn't quite dark enough, so I'm going in with R02 just on the inside there at the bottom of the ears. And then I wanted some contrast between the orange pumpkin, so I thought purples would work quite nicely. So I'm using V17, V15 and V12, and that's my favourite purple colour combination. Then for the wagon, I'm using some brown shades. I'm using E59, E57, E55 and E59. And again, the great thing about this is that it's wood grain, and so, or at least it appears wood grain to me. And so I thought that you didn't need to necessarily be too precise again with the colouring. Quite nice to have a little bit of texture into it. And I used the same shades for the wheels, but I apologise that I didn't catch that on screen. These are such tiny little images that I didn't want you just to see the back of my head while I was colouring that in, but I used the same shades. I'm then taking the Happy Pumpkin Season Dynamics and I'm placing those on top of the images and holding them down with some low tack tape. I can then run those through my die cutting machine, and then I can pop out the pieces at the other side. And then because I've stamped that pumpkin twice, I do then need to run it back through the die cutting machine again to cut out the other one. For the sentiment, I'm taking the one that reads, "If friends were pumpkins, I'd pick you," from the Happy Pumpkin Season set. And I'm placing that down onto a panel of black licorice cardstock. I'm taking an anti-static powder tool to prep the area, and then I can remove the excess powder with a brush. I'm then going to ink up the stamp using Versamark ink. This is a clear sticky ink so that when I add the embossing powder on top, it's going to stick to it. When I stamp the sentiment down, I'm being quite careful not to press it down too hard. I don't want to distort the sentiment at all, and I'd rather stamp it twice if I need to. I'm then applying some detail white embossing powder. So I do apply it a few times, tap off the excess, that way I get really nice coverage of that embossing powder. I can then heat set that until it's completely melted, and I try not to overheat the powder, so I do heat set from the front and the back until the heat gun is completely hot. And then if I get any extra little flecks of embossing powder where I don't want them, I just remove that with a craft knife. I've then cut that into a strip, and I'm just seeing where I want it to be placed on this panel of cardstock here. So I can bring in the image and see how far down I want it to go. I like using the rule of thirds, and so I want my focal point to be in the top third of the card base. So I'm just using a pencil here so that I can mark where I want that sentiment strip to be, and then I can place some memo tape underneath and remove that top mark. I'm then taking the mini cloud edges stencil and I'm placing that down onto this panel so that I can add some clouds for the background. So just figuring out which edge I want to use first, and then I can hold that down with some low tack tape. And I'm going to use Distress inks for the ink blending. So I have two shades, Dried Marigold and Spiced Marmalade, and I'm going to use the Dried Marigold first for the clouds themselves. So I'm starting off at the top and working my way down. You can do it either way, but I find that I get a nicer kind of lightness on the top of the clouds, like on the peaks of the fluffy bits, if that makes sense, if I start at the top and work my way down. So I'm just using ink blending brushes here for that. This panel of cardstock is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So it's just slightly smaller than a card base, so that I've got some kind of like a white outline around the edge of the card. So then I can move that stencil down, hold that again with some low tack tape and add the next cloud in. When I remove this one, I'm just going to bring in my image so that I can see how far down I want the clouds to be. I don't want them to go all the way to the bottom. Although I'm not creating a ground, I don't want it to look like the clouds are sort of going all the way to the bottom. So I'm just using a bit of ink there on the brush just to add that along the bottom. And then I'm going in with a slightly darker shade of Spiced Marmalade, and I'm going just around the edges with this. I wanted the edges to be slightly darker. I thought that it would kind of bring your eye into the middle of the area, and so that's where my focal point would be. I think that works quite nicely on skies. I think this would work really nicely for a Halloween card, but I thought it would still work quite nicely for an autumnal card as well. So I'm adding some on point precision glue onto the back of the sentiment strip here, and then I can place that down. I've still got that little mark there where I wanted the sentiment strip to be, so I can use that as a guide to place that down. And then to make sure that it's centered, I'm adding some white pieces of scrap paper or cardstock along the edges. That just helps me see where it's going to be cut off. So once I'm happy that it's centered, I can cut the excess pieces of that sentiment strip down with some scissors. I've then added some thin foam tape onto the back of the panel, just removing the backing tape of that foam tape. And then I can place that down onto an A2 sized white card base. So that's a finished size of 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. And I'm just using some scrap paper there just to help me press that down. I've added some more thin foam tape onto the back of the wagon piece here, and then I can place that down in the center so that the wheels are kind of just overlapping where the sentiment strip is. So that's kind of sort of ground it in a way, so that would be the ground, and then you've got the background with the clouds above it. I'm adding some little piece of foam tape just on the back of that pumpkin, adding some on point precision glue onto where the leaf is, and then I can place that down on the right hand side. And then for the next pumpkin, I know that there's only a tiny little bit of space there, but I do want to make sure that it doesn't kind of crush down. So I'm just adding a small amount of the foam tape just in between there, and then I can add some of that on point precision glue to the rest of the pumpkin. And then I can place that down. And then I'm just going to do the same thing with the one on the left hand side. And then to finish off, I'm adding some white gel pen highlights. So I'm just drawing a small line and then a couple of dots underneath. There's not a huge amount of contrast between the background and the images because it's all orange, and ordinarily I would use more of a contrasting colour, but because I wanted to go for that fall autumnal theme, I think it does work quite nicely. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.